Hi everyone. In this video, I am going to talk to you about a very interesting cultural interaction between East and West. And by East and West, I mean East Asia, specifically China, and the Western countries of Europe and America. More precisely, I am going to address the question of how Western vocabulary was and is still adapted into Chinese through a phenomenon called phono-semantic matching. Now, wait a second, you might say. What is even a phono-semantic matching? Well, to explain that, let me tell you what the problem is first. When Westerners think of the Chinese language, they often think of a mysterious language with weird sounds, weird letters, and most importantly, the idea that in Chinese, each letter corresponds to a whole word. From this idea, one might think that the Chinese language is quite rigid and conservative, that since all the words are attached to pre-existing letters, it is very difficult to create new words in Chinese, and even more difficult to borrow words from other languages. Right? Wrong! Actually, Chinese has borrowed plenty of words from other languages throughout history, including many words from the most influential Western cultures. However, what is true is that often those words are adapted to the Chinese language. And how is that done? Well, one very popular option is to make a phono-semantic matching. So, now that the problem is set, let's see what a phono-semantic matching is. This is a concept that was invented back in 2003 by linguist Ghil'ad Zuckermann. It's a translation method that exists in various languages of the world and is particularly common in Chinese. The basic idea is that when one language borrows a word from another language, it can just take the word as it is, or it can try to match it with one or several pre-existing words in order to create a new word whose literal meaning and pronunciation both resemble those of the original word. That's a phonosemantic matching, or PSM for short. So, now that I have defined both the problem and the main actor, here are the main questions we are going to focus on. First of all, we are going to see how PSMs were used historically in China. Then we will see which Western words the Chinese decided to adapt through this method and how they did that. Last but not least, we are going to address the question, what does this phenomenon tell us about the cultural relationship between China and the West? So let's get started. First of all, let's see some historical examples. Take this Chinese word, 祖母绿. It means emerald, and it literally means, in Chinese, grandmother's green. However, it is in fact a loan word from Arabic, as you can see. Here, the word for grandmother, 祖母, is only used for its sound. However, the word for green, 绿, is also a clear reference to the mineral's color, making this word a phonosemantic matching. Let's consider another example. Take the Chinese word for Turk or Turkic, 突厥. This word obviously comes from Old Turkic Turk. However, in Chinese, it literally means attacking and feinting. Why? Because back in the 15th century, when this word was first used, the Chinese were at war against Turkic tribes, the Gokturks, which they saw as barbarians. This is why they started calling those tribes with this offensive name. Please keep this word in mind, we will come back to it later. Now let's come to the interactions between the Chinese and the Westerners. Let's begin with the Chinese names for some Western countries. Portugal was one of the first Western powers to establish contacts with China. The Chinese name for Portugal is 葡萄牙, sometimes shortened to 葡国, where 国 means country in Chinese. While this word obviously comes from the original name, the word 葡萄 also means grapes in Chinese. This is due to the fact that one characteristic of the Portuguese that the Chinese found striking was the fact that they used to drink wine instead of tea or rice-based alcohol, for example. This is why the Chinese translated the name for Portugal using this phono-semantic matching, which we could translate as grapeland, for example. So let's see some more examples. England was originally transcribed to Chinese as Ghil'ad. This word was then shortened to Ingguo, which is the current most common name for the UK in Chinese. This name contains the word Ying, which means hero in Chinese. So for the Chinese, England, or rather UK, is literally Hero Land. France was transcribed Falanqi, then quickly shortened to Faguo, the current Chinese name for France. Fa means law in Chinese, hence France in Chinese literally means lowland. America was originally transcribed as Yamei Lijia, then shortened to Meiguo, which is the current Chinese name for the USA. Note that in this case the transcription is based on the second character. But that's because the character Mei means beautiful in Chinese. So the Chinese name for the USA literally means beauty land. One more example. Germany was transcribed De Yizhi from German, Deutsch. It was then shortened to De Guo, which is the current Chinese name for Germany. De means virtue in Chinese, hence the Chinese name for Germany literally means virtue land. Now let's stop for a second. Remember the Chinese word for Turkic? Now I want you to compare that name with those country names as well as with the Chinese name for China, Zhongguo, which is usually translated as Middle Realm, intended as the country at the center of the world. As you can see, the Chinese name for the most important Western powers are not offensive at all. Instead, they are quite flattering, and they also look quite similar to the Chinese name for China. This means that in the eyes of the Chinese, Westerners were not just another kind of barbarians, but honorable and respectable people whose countries deserved honorable and respectable names. Let's see now some more PSMs. Just like in ancient times, the Chinese used this method to translate some specific Western cultural elements. For example, the Chinese name for Catholic priest. There's a native word in Chinese, siduo, which literally means in charge of the bell, duo being a kind of Chinese bell. However, by extension, this word also referred to a teacher in ancient China. Well, when the Portuguese arrived to China, bringing with them lots of Catholic priests, the Chinese noted that they were also a kind of teacher who also used to ring a bell. And since the Portuguese word for priest, sacerdote, also happened to sound quite similar to suduo, the Chinese must have thought, well, let's just use the same word then. Another example. Take the word pharaoh, which comes from ancient Greek. The Chinese word for pharaoh is Falao, literally meaning the old man of the law, which is quite appropriate for a king. These are quite old examples. However, the Chinese never stopped using PSMs up until today. In particular, when it comes to vocabulary related to modern science and technology, Chinese has a lot of phono-semantic matchings. For example, the word for gene in Chinese is jiyin, which literally means the basic cause or the fundamental cause. In fact, genes could be considered to be the base of the expression of the DNA. A few more examples. The Chinese word for tractor, tuolaji, literally means pulling machine, which is exactly what tractors are. A more recent word, the Chinese word for World Wide Web is Wanwei Wang, which can be translated as myriad dimensions net. Note that in this case, the Chinese word is not exactly a phono-semantic matching of the original English words, but rather of the acronym WWW. Finally, an even more recent example, Heike, the Chinese word for hacker, which literally means black visitor. I could keep going on and on, but I think I have already made my point. However, don't be fooled. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, translated common names is not even the most common way of using PSMs in modern Chinese. A much more common usage is commercial brand names. After Deng Xiaoping's reforms, many international brands enter the Chinese market. To sound more attractive, brands will often translate or adapt their name to Chinese. And to do that, one very common method is phono-semantic matching. The most famous example of PSM in Chinese, and not only among brands but in general, is probably the American brand Coca-Cola. Its Chinese name is 可口可乐, literally meaning delicious and funny. Delicious because it's a drink, and funny because of the bubbles, I guess. A few more examples. The German car brand Mercedes-Benz is called in Chinese 奔驰 from the word Benz. This word is actually a native Chinese word meaning to rush, so very appropriate for a car. The French supermarket brand Carrefour is known in China as 家乐福, which can be translated as funny family blessing. Nothing to say, very attractive indeed. Finally, the Swedish brand IKEA is called in China 宜家, literally meaning suitable for the house. True. Please note that all these PSMs were not spontaneously invented by the Chinese, but rather carefully imagined by the companies themselves as a key part of their commercial strategy in China. We are not done yet. Let's see one more important application of PSMs in Chinese. Until now, we have mostly been looking at names for objects, places, or concepts. But what if I told you you can also use a PSM for translating a person's name? Here's why you will do that. Usually in Chinese, personal names are transcribed by using a set of standardized characters that are used only for their sound and not for their meaning. So for example, let's imagine your name is Quentin Johnson. In that case, your name will be transcribed in Chinese characters as Quentin Yue Han Xuan. Sounds awful, right? Well, for the Chinese too. This is because the Chinese phonetics and writing systems are very different from those of Western languages. The only reason why the Chinese transcribe words like this is because it's very easy to standardize and to tell a computer how to do it, for example. In fact, if you write your own name in automatic translator, it will transcribe your name into Chinese automatically using exactly this method. However, when the Chinese care about some Western foreigner, they will usually give them a more Chinese sounding name. For example, the names of some important Western historical figures were translated to Chinese by phono-semantic matching. Geoffrey Chaucer, father of the English literature, is known in China as 教叟, meaning tall gentleman. Saint Joan of Arc, national heroine of France, is known as 贞德, meaning chaste and virtuous. As you may know, she was a warrior and remained virgin all her life. Finally, the Cid, national hero of Spain, is known as Cide, which can be translated as bright and virtuous. Now, actually, there are not so many examples of PSMs for historical figures. However, PSMs are often used for modern Western celebrities. For the reason I told you, celebrities are often given a nickname in China, which then generally spreads on the internet. Well, sometimes, definitely not always, but sometimes, those names can be phono-semantic matchings. For example, singer Nicki Minaj is called in China 麻辣鸡, literally meaning spicy chicken. Note that those nicknames are often humorous. Another singer, Lana Del Rey, is called Dalei, which means to thunder. Actor Ryan Gosling is called Gosling, which can be translated as High Commander. Finally, actor Timothy Chalamet is called Tian Cha, literally meaning sweet tea. However, if you are not a star but you still want a cool Chinese name, you can still have one. In fact, it is quite common that a stranger living in China chooses or is given by their Chinese friends a Chinese name which is a phono-semantic matching of the actual name, so it's easier for them to adapt. In fact, there are a lot of videos on the internet dealing with this topic. Here is just a few of them. I leave you the links in the description if you want to learn the full method. For the purpose of this video, I will just give you one example. So let's take again the name Quentin Johnson. As we saw before, just transcribing it is terrible. So now, if we make a phono-semantic matching instead, we could come up with something like this. This possible name I just invented is much more similar to an actual Chinese name, and it also has a quite good meaning. Zhang is a common Chinese surname, and it sounds like the beginning of Johnson. Kun can be translated as sincere, and a Qin is a kind of Chinese zither. So the Chinese name literally means sincere zither. Quite poetic, isn't it? This, of course, is just one of the possible PSMs you can do with this name, but you could also find many others that fit better your personality. Now, I want to end this video by talking about American Vice President Kamala Harris. In some cities of the USA, like Los Angeles, San Francisco, or New York, candidates must present at the elections by giving their name also in Chinese characters. This is because in those places there are important Chinese minorities who cannot always read English. What most candidates would do is just going for the standard transcription method. However, Kamala Harris, in order to seduce Chinese American electors, came up with some Chinese American friends of hers with her own Chinese name, He Jinli. This is just to show you how much influence Chinese culture can have. In conclusion, what can we say? First, that adapting Western words by PSMs is very common in Chinese, both historically and even more in recent times. Secondly, the kind of PSMs used to refer to Western cultures as opposed to other cultures show very clearly that at some point the Chinese started to look up at the West. And even now, this still remains partially true. Finally, this strong tendency to adapt Western words instead of just taking them as they are shows that China still remains very proud of its language and of its culture and does not consider it to lie beneath Western culture, but rather at least at the same level or even above. Thus, even when it comes to loanwords, the Chinese language still remains the main reference. So thank you all for watching this video. If you find it interesting, don't hesitate to share it. If you want to learn more about this topic, you can check the description where I put all the sources I used to make this video. Bye!